Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Halloween night 2022 should have been just another fun night out in downtown Denver. At 31, I'd reached that age where costume parties felt more like an obligation than excitement. But my roommate Jenna had convinced me to join her and our friend Ashley for a bar crawl. We'd spent the afternoon putting together last-minute costumes. I went as a vampire with fake blood dripping down my chin. Jenna dressed as a zombie nurse with theatrical wounds painted on her arms. And Ashley transformed herself into a witch with this elaborate green face paint that took her 2 hours to perfect. The three of us had been friends since college, and even though we all had regular jobs now, I worked in marketing, Jenna taught elementary school, and Ashley managed a boutique downtown. We still made time for these nights out together. That particular evening started like any other Halloween celebration, with overpriced drinks, terrible music, and grown adults stumbling around in polyester costumes. The crawl took us through 5 different bars, each one more packed than the last, and by midnight we were exhausted and ready to head home. We'd been smart enough to leave our cars at home, planning to use a rideshare. But when we stumbled out of the final bar onto Larimer Street, the wait times were showing 45 minutes minimum. Ashley kept refreshing her app, cursing at the surge pricing that had hit 3 times the normal rate, while Jenna sat on the curb trying not to smudge her zombie makeup. That's when this guy in a firefighter costume approached us, one of those realistic ones with actual heavy gear, not the cheap Party City version. He had this friendly demeanor, pointing to a black SUV parked across the street and explaining that he was actually a rideshare driver who'd been picking up fares all night between stopping at parties. His app was supposedly glitching, he said, but he could take us for cash at the regular rate if we needed a ride. Everything about him seemed legitimate. He knew the exact base fare to our neighborhood, had one of those pine tree air fresheners hanging from his mirror, and even offered us bottles of water from a cooler in his back seat. The thing that really sold us was how professional he acted, checking our destination address on his phone's GPS, confirming our names even though we hadn't given them yet, which seemed weird for maybe half a second until Jenna laughed and said her name. Then we all followed suit. He helped Ashley into the front seat because she was wearing these massive platform boots that made walking treacherous, while Jenna and I climbed into the back. The interior was spotless, with leather seats and phone chargers in every door pocket. Exactly like every other rideshare I'd ever taken. He even had a playlist of popular music going, not too loud, and asked if we wanted to change the station. During the ride, he chatted casually about how busy Halloween was for drivers, mentioning specific street closures downtown that we'd noticed earlier, and complaining about drunk passengers who'd made a mess in his car the previous weekend. The water bottles he'd offered were sealed, store-bought, nothing suspicious about them at all. I remember specifically checking because my mom had drilled stranger danger into my head since childhood. What happened next exists only in fragments, like trying to piece together a dream that keeps slipping away the more you chase it. I remember Ashley laughing at something on her phone, the glow lighting up her green painted face in the darkness of the car. I remember Jenna talking about some parent at her school who'd complained about the Halloween decorations being too scary for kindergarteners. I remember the driver adjusting his rearview mirror and asking if we needed to make any stops on the way home. Then there's just nothing. Not blackness, not sleep, but a complete absence of memory. Like those hours were surgically removed from my brain. The next thing I knew, I was waking up fully clothed on my couch at 4 in the afternoon on Sunday, still wearing my vampire costume with the fake blood now crusty and flaking onto my cushions. My phone was dead on the coffee table. My keys were somehow in the kitchen sink, and my shoes were placed neatly by the front door even though I never ever put them there. The first thing I did was charge my phone, desperate to piece together what had happened through texts or photos, but there was nothing after midnight except for 13 missed calls from Ashley's boyfriend, Connor. My call log showed I'd apparently called Jenna at 3:47 a.m., but I had zero recollection of this, and when I tried calling her back, it went straight to voicemail. The panic really started setting in when Connor answered on the first ring, his voice frantic, asking if Ashley was with me. She'd never come home, he said, hadn't answered any of his calls or texts, and her phone was going straight to voicemail just like Jenna's. He'd already called the hospitals, even driven to her parents' house in Aurora thinking maybe she'd gone there, but nobody had seen her since she left for the bar crawl with us. My head was pounding, not like a normal hangover, but this deep, disorienting fog that made thinking feel like swimming through syrup. I told Connor I'd just woken up, that I couldn't remember anything after getting in that car, and the silence on his end stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Jenna showed up at my apartment 20 minutes later, still wearing her zombie nurse costume, mascara streaked down her face in black rivers. She had the same story, waking up in her own bed with no memory of getting there. Her apartment door unlocked even though she was obsessive about security. Her purse contents spread across her kitchen counter in a way she'd never do. Neither of us could remember anything after those first few minutes in the SUV, but both of us had woken up safely in our homes while Ashley was just gone. We spent the next 3 hours retracing our steps, calling every bar we'd visited, even walking down Larimer Street looking for that black SUV or anyone dressed as a firefighter who might have been driving for ride-shares. The bars all remembered us. Hard to forget 3 women in elaborate costumes, but nobody had security footage of the street where we'd gotten picked up. One bouncer at the third bar mentioned he'd seen us talking to someone in firefighter gear, said the guy had been hanging around all night but wasn't actually going into any of the bars, just lingering on the sidewalks where people were looking for rides. Connor had already filed a missing person report by Sunday evening, and 2 detectives came to my apartment Monday morning to take our statements. Detective Garrison, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair, kept asking about the water bottles. Did we drink them? Did we see him drink one? Did we keep any of them? Of course we hadn't kept them, and neither Jenna nor I could even remember if we'd actually drunk the water or just held the bottles. The younger detective, Reeves, was more interested in the driver himself, pulling up photos on his tablet of registered rideshare drivers to see if we recognized anyone. None of them looked familiar, but then again, between the darkness and our intoxicated state, I could barely picture his face beyond a vague impression of stubble and what might have been brown eyes. They asked about the make and model of the SUV, but all I could tell them was that it was black, maybe a Chevy or GMC, definitely newer because it had that backup camera screen in the dashboard. Jenna remembered even less, just that the seats were tan or beige leather, and that there'd been an energy drink can in one of the cup holders. The breakthrough came Wednesday afternoon when Detective Garrison called to say they'd found security footage from an ATM camera 2 blocks from where we'd gotten picked up. The timestamp showed 12:23 a.m., our car pulling away from the curb with all 3 of us visible through the windows. The license plate was partially obscured by mud or something deliberately smeared on it, but they could make out that it was a Colorado plate starting with F. More importantly, they'd tracked the vehicle through various traffic cameras heading east through downtown. But then it just vanished after turning into an industrial area near the railroad tracks. No cameras covered that specific zone, and the SUV never emerged onto any of the main roads that had surveillance. They dispatched units to search the area, checking abandoned warehouses and empty lots, but it was like the vehicle had simply evaporated. Garrison mentioned something that made my chest tighten. The ATM footage showed the driver getting out briefly to help Ashley into the front seat, and he was wearing thick work gloves despite it being a warm October night. Friday morning changed everything in the worst possible way. A jogger found Ashley's phone in a drainage ditch about 8 miles outside the city limits, near an old access road that nobody used anymore except for illegal dumping. The phone was still recording. It had been recording audio since 12:31 a.m. Sunday morning, roughly 8 minutes after we'd gotten into that SUV. 67 hours of continuous audio until the battery finally died. The police wouldn't tell us everything that was on the recording, but Detective Garrison's face when she mentioned it told me more than her words ever could. She went pale when she explained that the first hour contained mostly muffled voices and car sounds, then long periods of silence broken by occasional noises they were still analyzing. What they did share was that around the 40-minute mark, you could hear Ashley's voice very clearly saying she felt sick, then asking why we weren't responding to her. After that, her voice didn't appear on the recording again, just ambient sound and what might have been footsteps on gravel much later. The audio revealed something else that made everything infinitely worse. At 1:15 a.m., you could clearly hear a garage door opening and closing. Then there were distinct sounds of movement, like furniture being shifted or heavy objects being dragged across concrete. At 2:47 a.m., there was the sound of a different vehicle starting, probably a truck based on the engine noise. The recording captured this second vehicle driving for approximately 22 minutes before stopping. Then came the worst part, the sound of a shovel hitting dirt, rhythmic and methodical for nearly an hour. The police had tech specialists enhancing the audio, trying to pick up any identifying sounds or voices during those crucial hours. They'd also used the phone's GPS data to track its movement, but whoever had it had disabled location services after the first hour, and the phone had stayed in that ditch from approximately 4 a.m. Sunday until it was found Friday. Garrison asked if we remembered anyone mentioning construction sites or property outside the city, but our minds were just blank walls where those hours should have been. Saturday brought the most terrifying revelation yet, when the tech team managed to enhance a portion of the audio from around 3:30 a.m. They isolated what sounded like a muffled conversation between two men, our firefighter and someone else. The second voice was asking about the other two, and whether they'd remember anything. The response was too garbled to make out completely, but the specialists detected the word dose and something that sounded like their apartments. That's when I realized with absolute clarity that this man had been in my home, had physically carried me inside, arranged my belongings, and left me on my couch like some kind of twisted dollhouse figure. Jenna broke down completely when we heard this, realizing he'd done the same to her, had probably stood in our bedrooms watching us unconscious, deciding what to do with us. The police immediately processed our apartments for DNA and fingerprints, but whoever this was had been meticulous. Not a single print besides ours, no DNA evidence, no fibers or hair that didn't belong to us or our regular visitors. Even the water bottles from the car were gone, likely disposed of along with any other evidence from the vehicle. The investigation intensified with the FBI getting involved due to the suspected kidnapping across state lines, based on some background noise in the audio that suggested movement into Wyoming or Nebraska. They brought in cadaver dogs to search the industrial area where the SUV had vanished, and while the dogs alerted to several spots, no body was found. Yet. Meanwhile, Connor was barely functioning, staying at his parents' house because he couldn't stand being in the apartment he'd shared with Ashley. The worst part was how calculated everything had been. This person had studied rideshare apps, knew exactly what price to quote, understood which areas had surveillance gaps, and had somehow managed to dose 3 people so precisely that 2 of us survived while 1 disappeared. He'd even known our names before we gave them, which meant he'd been watching us throughout the night, possibly heard us introduce ourselves at one of the bars, or seen our IDs when we were getting them checked. The firefighter costume wasn't random either. People inherently trust first responders, let their guard down around someone who seems like a hero. Every single detail had been orchestrated, from the legitimate-looking car setup to knowing exactly how to make Jenna and me appear like we'd just had too much to drink, ensuring nobody would immediately suspect foul play when we couldn't remember our night. The break in the case came 2 weeks later through pure luck. A construction worker renovating an old fire station 40 miles away found a firefighter costume stuffed behind a loose wall panel, along with a set of car keys and a roll of cash. The keys belonged to a black Suburban registered to a man named Gregory Hoffman, who'd been reported missing by his family 3 days before Halloween. His SUV was found a week after that, completely stripped and burned in a field near the Kansas border. but forensics still managed to pull DNA from blood traces in the trunk that matched Ashley. Gregory Hoffman's body turned up in his own basement. He'd been dead since October 28th, killed in his own home while his family thought he was away on a hunting trip. The real killer had taken his vehicle, his identity, and used both to hunt on Halloween night. Security footage from a gas station near Gregory's house showed a man filling up the Suburban on October 30th, wearing a baseball cap and keeping his face turned away from cameras, but his build matched what little we could remember. The same man appeared on traffic cameras driving toward downtown Denver on Halloween night, already wearing the firefighter costume. They never found Ashley's body, though they searched for months using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and volunteer search teams. They never caught the man who took her either. The DNA found at Gregory's house didn't match anyone in the system, and the fingerprints they lifted from Gregory's basement door were from someone who'd never been arrested or worked in any job requiring prints. Jenna moved back to Ohio to live with her family, unable to handle staying in Denver. Connor left the state entirely. Last I heard, he was somewhere in Florida trying to start over. As for me, I still live in the same apartment, though I installed 3 deadbolts and a security system that would rival a bank's. I still can't remember those missing hours, even after trying hypnotherapy and various other treatments to recover the memories. Sometimes I wonder if not remembering is actually a mercy, if my brain is protecting me from something too horrible to process. The police keep the case open, calling occasionally when they have a lead that never pans out. They did tell me one last detail from the audio. In the final hours of recording, just before the phone died, you could hear a distant train horn and what sounded like someone whistling a children's song, though they could never identify which one. Ashley's parents still call me sometimes, not blaming me, but desperately hoping I'll remember something, anything, that might help them find their daughter. All I can tell them is what I know, that she got in that car with us, and then she was gone, and 2 of us were lucky enough to wake up. Halloween night, 2018. At 16, my biggest worry was whether Brad from chemistry class noticed my new haircut. My parents owned a small bookstore downtown, and we lived in this old Victorian house at the edge of Riverside, California, where the neighborhood meets the woods. That night, my younger brother Nathan was at a sleepover, and my parents had gone to bed around 11 after handing out candy to the last trick-or-treaters. I stayed up in my room, scrolling through Instagram and texting my best friend Kayla about the party we'd missed, because my dad said it would run too late. The house was finally quiet, just the occasional creak of old wood settling, and the wind rustling through the massive oak tree outside my window. Around 12:30, I heard it. This soft, rhythmic knocking coming from downstairs. Not loud or aggressive, just persistent. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. At first, I thought maybe some drunk teenagers were messing around, trying to get one last scare in before Halloween officially ended. We'd had problems before with kids from the high school throwing eggs at houses or leaving creepy dolls on porches as pranks. I crept out of my room, avoiding the squeaky floorboard near my door, and made my way down the hallway. The knocking continued, steady and patient, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. From the landing, I could see our front door through the stairway railings, and the porch light was on, casting long shadows through the frosted glass panels. I tiptoed down to the living room and moved toward the window beside the door, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The blinds were closed, but I could angle them just enough to see outside without being noticed. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. There was a woman sitting on our porch steps, facing away from the door. She was barefoot, which seemed strange for late October, and her shoulders were shaking like she was crying or maybe just cold. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging down her back in dark, matted strands. She wore what looked like a light blue dress or nightgown, but even from behind, I could see dark stains spreading across the fabric. The way she sat there, hunched over and rocking slightly, made her look broken somehow. She wasn't knocking anymore, she was just sitting there trembling in the yellow porch light. I must have made some noise because she started to turn her head, and I quickly stepped back from the window. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me wanted to wake up my parents, but another part kept thinking maybe she needed help. Maybe she'd been in an accident or someone had hurt her. I peered through the blinds again, this time getting a partial view of her profile. Her face was pale, almost gray under the porch light, and there were dark streaks running down her cheeks, whether from makeup, dirt, or something else I couldn't tell. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the street, quick, nervous glances like she expected someone to appear at any moment. Then she started knocking again, harder this time, and I heard her voice, hoarse and desperate, calling out something I couldn't quite make out through the door. The knocking got loud enough that I heard my parents' bedroom door open upstairs. My dad came down in his pajamas and bathrobe, squinting in the hallway light. "What's going on?" he asked, seeing me pressed against the wall near the window. I pointed toward the door and whispered about the woman outside. He frowned and moved to look through the peephole. I watched his expression change from annoyed to concerned in seconds. He turned to me and said quietly, "Go get your mother. Tell her to bring her phone." While I ran upstairs, I heard him unlocking the deadbolt. My mom was already awake, sitting up in bed, and when I told her about the woman, she grabbed her phone and followed me back down. We found my dad standing in the doorway, the chain still on, talking to someone outside. Through the gap in the door, I could hear the woman's voice clearly now, raw and frantic. Please, you have to help me. He's coming for me. I got away, but he's coming. Please let me in, please." Her words tumbled out in a rush, some of them slurred like she might be drunk or in shock. My dad was trying to calm her down, asking her what happened, who was after her, if she needed an ambulance. But she kept repeating the same things, that someone was coming, that she'd barely gotten away, that we needed to call the police right now. My mom was already dialing 911, giving our address in that controlled voice she used during emergencies. The woman outside started crying harder, these horrible, choking sobs that made my chest tight. Then suddenly she went quiet and whispered, "Oh God, I hear his car. He found me. He found me again." My dad immediately shut and locked the door, telling us to get away from the windows. The woman outside started pounding on the door, screaming now, begging us not to leave her out there. It was awful, the sound of pure terror in her voice. My mom was still on the phone with the dispatcher, explaining the situation, saying we needed officers immediately. Through all the chaos, I didn't hear any car engine, didn't see any headlights through the curtains, but the woman was hysterical, scrambling around our porch, her bare feet slapping against the wooden boards. We could hear her trying our windows, pulling at them desperately. My dad grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet and positioned himself between us and the front door. For maybe 30 seconds, everything went silent except for my mom's voice giving details to the police. Then we heard the woman shriek, not a scream of fear, but something primal and furious. And the sound of her running, those bare feet slapping down our porch steps and onto the gravel driveway. I rushed to the side window despite my dad yelling at me to stay back. In the moonlight, I saw her running toward the tree line behind our house, her pale dress or nightgown flowing behind her like a ghost. She moved fast for someone who'd seemed so injured and desperate, disappearing into the woods within seconds. The police arrived about 8 minutes later. 2 patrol cars with their lights flashing, officers with flashlights checking our porch and yard. They found blood on our steps, just drops and smears, and bare footprints in the dirt leading toward the woods. My parents explained everything while I sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket my mom had brought me, trying to process what had just happened. The officers took our statements, then 2 of them went into the woods with their flashlights while the others stayed to search the area around our house. We waited in the living room for what felt like forever, drinking the coffee my mom had made to keep us alert. The officers who'd gone into the woods came back after about 40 minutes, shaking their heads. They'd followed the footprints for maybe a quarter mile before losing them near the creek that runs through the forest. No sign of the woman anywhere. They called for backup and a K-9 unit, expanding the search area. One officer stayed at our house in case she came back while the others coordinated the search. My dad kept pacing, checking the locks on all the doors and windows. None of us could understand how someone so desperate for help would suddenly run away like that, especially barefoot into the woods at night. The officer mentioned that sometimes domestic violence victims act erratically, torn between seeking help and protecting their abusers. But something about the whole situation felt wrong to me. The way she'd said someone was coming when there was no car, the way she'd switched from terrified to furious in seconds. Around 4 a.m, we got the news. A detective came to our door, his face serious and tired. They'd found a car crashed into a ravine about 3 miles from our house, on the old service road that runs parallel to the woods. A silver sedan, completely smashed up like it had gone off the road at high speed. Inside were 2 bodies, a man in his 30s in the driver's seat, and a woman in the passenger seat. Both had been dead for hours, the detective said, probably since before midnight. The woman matched the general description of who we'd seen. Similar hair color, similar age range. But here's what made everyone go silent. Both bodies were still wearing their seatbelts, and there was no evidence anyone else had been in the car. The blood pattern showed they'd both died on impact. There was no way either of them could have walked away from that crash, let alone run to our house and pound on our door. The detective asked us more questions, had us describe every detail about the woman we'd seen. They brought a forensic team to collect the blood samples from our porch and photograph the footprints. My mom showed them the recording from our doorbell camera. We'd forgotten about it in all the chaos. The footage was grainy in the darkness, but you could see her clearly enough. A woman in a pale blue dress sitting on our steps, then standing and pounding on the door, then running toward the woods. The timestamp showed 12:47 a.m. But according to the coroner's initial assessment, the accident had happened around 11 p.m., maybe earlier. The detective kept asking if we were sure we'd only seen one woman, if maybe someone else had been hiding nearby. But we all saw the same person, heard the same voice. They continued searching for days, even brought in dogs specially trained to track injured people. Nothing. No other footprints, no torn fabric caught on branches, no blood trail in the woods beyond our property. The official investigation went on for weeks. They identified the victims, a couple from 2 towns over who'd been driving back from a Halloween party. The man had a blood alcohol level over the legal limit. The theory was he'd taken the back road to avoid the main highway and lost control on a curve. But they never found any explanation for what we experienced that night. No escaped mental patient, no missing person who matched the woman we'd seen, no identical twin sister. The blood on our porch matched the female victim from the crash, but the forensics team couldn't explain how it got there. Eventually, the case was closed as an accident with unexplained circumstances. We moved out 6 months later, not because we were scared exactly, but because none of us could walk past those porch steps without remembering her voice, her desperate knocking, the way she'd run into the darkness. I still dream about it sometimes. Wake up thinking I hear someone at the door begging to be let in. The thing about college parties is that they all blend together after a while. But that night in October at the house on Birch Avenue is burned into my memory like a scar that won't fade. I was halfway through my junior year at State University, grinding through economics courses and surviving on ramen and energy drinks like every other broke college student. My roommate Jake Sullivan and I had been inseparable since freshman orientation, one of those friendships that just clicked from day one. Jake had this incredible ability to make friends with literally anyone. He'd walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 5 new contacts and plans for the weekend. He was the guy who'd lend you his last $20 knowing you'd probably forget to pay him back, who'd drive across town at 3 a.m. to pick you up when your ride bailed, who knew exactly when you needed to hear a terrible joke to break the tension during finals week. We'd been through everything together those first 2 years. Failed exams, successful parties, that disastrous spring break road trip where his car broke down in the middle of nowhere. That particular Saturday night, We were headed to what everyone was calling the party of the semester, hosted by some seniors renting this ancient house that looked like it hadn't seen repairs since the 70s. Jake and I showed up around 10 wearing matching zombie costumes, basically just thrift store clothes we'd destroyed with scissors and covered in fake blood that kept staining everything we touched. The house was absolutely insane when we walked in. Easily 200 people crammed wall to wall. The air so thick with artificial fog and body heat that breathing felt like work. The seniors had gone all out transforming the place. Seizure-inducing strobe lights in what used to be the living room. Kitchen converted into a chaotic bar where people were mixing drinks with whatever they could find. Fake cobwebs and plastic skeletons hanging from every doorway and light fixture. But the basement was the main attraction. They'd turned it into this underground club with ultraviolet lights everywhere. The concrete walls covered in neon paint that glowed like toxic waste in the darkness. Getting down there required fighting through a mass of sweaty bodies on stairs so narrow you had to turn sideways. Everyone holding drinks above their heads to avoid spilling, the temperature rising with each step down. Once you made it to the bottom, the heat hit you like walking into a sauna. The bass from the speaker so intense it felt like your bones were vibrating. Everyone packed so tight you moved as one giant organism in the darkness. Around midnight, Jake and I were down in that basement, pressed against the back wall trying to catch our breath between songs. The face paint we'd applied so carefully earlier was now running down our faces in gray streaks, making us look more like melting wax figures than zombies. Jake had been dancing with this girl dressed as a vampire for the past hour, but she disappeared upstairs with her friends, leaving him doing these exaggerated dance moves to make me laugh. The crowd around us was getting wilder by the minute. People climbing on each other's shoulders, drinks flying everywhere. Someone had started spraying glow-in-the-dark silly string from a can they'd brought. Jake leaned over and shouted something in my ear about needing air, that the heat was making him dizzy, and started pushing his way toward what he thought was an exit door in the corner. I nodded and turned back to the crowd, figuring he'd be back in 5 minutes like always. There were so many people crushed together that when someone pushed from behind, we all moved forward like dominoes, and by the time I looked back to where Jake had been heading, he'd already vanished into the mass of bodies. 20 minutes passed, then 30, and Jake still hadn't come back. At first I wasn't worried, figured he'd probably run into someone upstairs, maybe got caught up in a conversation or found his way to the bathroom line that stretched halfway down the hall. I pushed my way up the basement stairs, the temperature dropping with each step, my shirt soaked through with sweat going cold against my skin. The main floor was just as packed but definitely cooler. People sprawled on couches, couples making out in corners. Someone had started a beer pong tournament in what used to be the dining room. I checked the kitchen, the back porch where smokers had congregated, even waited outside the bathroom for 10 minutes thinking he might be sick in there. Asked a few people if they'd seen a tall guy in a zombie costume, but that description fit about 30 different people at the party. The weird thing was that Jake's phone kept going straight to voicemail, not ringing, just immediate voicemail like it was turned off or dead. That wasn't like him at all. Jake was the type who'd answer texts while showering, who kept a portable charger in his pocket because he never let his phone die. By 1 a.m, I was starting to panic. I'd searched every room in the house twice, even pushed my way back down to the basement thinking maybe I'd missed him in the crowd. The party was still raging, but I couldn't focus on anything except finding Jake. I grabbed this guy Steve who lived down the hall from us in the dorms, explained that my roommate had disappeared, and he helped me search again. We went through the whole house systematically this time. Every bedroom, closet, even checked the backyard where people had built a bonfire in a metal trash can. Steve suggested maybe Jake had hooked up with someone and left, but that didn't make sense either. Jake would have texted me, would have sent one of his stupid emoji combinations that only he thought were funny, would have let me know he was heading out. Plus, his car was still parked exactly where we'd left it 3 blocks away. I'd run out to check, hoping maybe he'd felt sick and gone to sleep it off. The windows were fogged up from the cold, but I could see through enough to know he wasn't inside, and his spare key was still hidden in the magnetic box under the wheel well. where he always kept it. I finally found the host, this senior named Kevin Brennan, who I'd only met once before, and asked him if there were any other exits from the basement, anywhere Jake might have gone to get some air. Kevin looked at me like I was insane, his pupils dilated and clearly several drinks deep into the night. He said the basement only had one entrance, those narrow stairs everyone was using, and that the door in the corner had been locked and blocked off for months. When I insisted Jake had headed toward that corner door, Kevin got defensive, said that area was off limits, that they'd specifically piled boxes and old furniture in front of it to keep drunk people from messing around back there. But Jake had definitely walked in that direction. I could picture it clearly, him weaving through the crowd, his hand up in that half wave he always did, heading straight for that corner. Kevin started getting aggressive, asking why I was trying to cause problems, saying maybe my friend just left without telling me, that I needed to chill out and stop making accusations. The music was still pounding from the basement, but suddenly it felt threatening instead of exciting, like the rhythm of something terrible happening just out of sight. Steve and I went back down to the basement one more time, using our phone flashlights to cut through the UV lighting and actually see that corner clearly. The crowd had thinned out just a little, enough that we could push through to the back wall without too much resistance. There were definitely boxes stacked up in that corner, old cardboard things with water damage and torn edges, plus what looked like a broken couch standing on its end. But when I looked closer, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There were fresh scrape marks on the concrete floor, like something heavy had been dragged recently. The dust patterns didn't match either. You could see clean rectangular shapes where boxes had been sitting for a long time, but they weren't lined up with where the boxes were now. Someone had moved all this stuff recently, maybe even tonight. Steve saw it too, started pulling at one of the boxes to see what was behind them. But then Kevin appeared with two other guys, all of them bigger than us, telling us we needed to leave immediately. They weren't asking. They physically grabbed our arms and started marching us toward the stairs. Kevin saying something about calling the cops if we didn't get out of his house right now, that we were killing the vibe and freaking people out. They literally threw us out the front door, Steve stumbling and almost falling down the porch steps. I tried to explain one more time that my best friend was missing, that something was seriously wrong, but Kevin just stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. His face completely changed from the friendly party host to something cold and dangerous. He said Jake had probably just found a girl and bailed, that it happened all the time at parties, and if I came back or tried to cause more trouble, he'd make sure campus security heard about it. The door slammed in our faces, the deadbolt clicking into place, and suddenly we were standing on the sidewalk in the cold October air, while the party continued inside without us. Steve wanted to leave, kept saying we should just wait until tomorrow when everyone sobered up, but I couldn't shake the image of those scrape marks on the floor. I called Jake's phone probably 50 times, sent text after text, even tried calling his mom back home but hung up before it connected because what would I even say? That he vanished at a party and the host was acting suspicious? The police would laugh at me, probably assume he was just drunk somewhere or had hooked up like everyone kept suggesting. I stayed outside that house until 4 in the morning, sitting in my car parked across the street, watching people slowly trickle out as the party died down. Every time someone emerged from the front door, my heart would race thinking it might be Jake, but it never was. Around 3:30, I saw Kevin and his roommates carrying garbage bags out to the curb, moving quickly and quietly like they didn't want to draw attention. One of the bags tore open when they tossed it, and I could see what looked like clothing spilling out, but they quickly gathered everything up and stuffed it into another bag before I could get a better look. The basement lights stayed on long after the rest of the house went dark, and I could see shadows moving past the small ground-level windows, but the glass was too grimy and painted over to make out what was happening inside. My phone battery died around dawn, and I finally drove back to campus, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe Jake had felt sick and someone had taken him to the hospital. Maybe he'd had some kind of allergic reaction to something. Maybe there was a back exit I didn't know about, and he'd left without his car for some reason. Sunday morning, I filed a missing person report with campus police, even though they clearly didn't take it seriously at first. The officer kept asking if Jake had been drinking, if we'd had an argument, if he had a history of taking off without telling anyone. I gave them Kevin's name and address, explained everything about the basement and the blocked door, the suspicious behavior, how Jake's car was still there. It wasn't until I mentioned that Jake was supposed to take a midterm on Monday, that he had perfect attendance and would never miss an exam, that they finally agreed to do a welfare check at the house. I went with them, sitting in the back of the patrol car as we drove to Birch Avenue, my stomach churning with a mixture of hope and dread. The house looked different in daylight, shabbier, smaller, with Halloween decorations hanging limp and sad from the porch railings. Kevin answered the door looking haggard and annoyed, but his expression changed quickly when he saw the uniforms. He was suddenly cooperative, concerned even, saying he'd help however he could, that he hoped Jake was okay, that these parties sometimes got out of hand and people wandered off. The police searched the main floors first while Kevin followed them around, explaining that hundreds of people had been through the house, that it would be impossible to know where everyone went. When they got to the basement, I watched Kevin's jaw tighten as they approached that corner with the stacked boxes. He quickly mentioned that area was just storage, that it had been blocked off for months because of water damage, that no one could have gone back there during the party. But one of the officers, an older woman with sharp eyes, noticed the same scrape marks I'd seen and asked Kevin to move the boxes. He protested at first, said it was dangerous back there, that the landlord had specifically told them not to let anyone pass that point, but the officers insisted. It took them about 10 minutes to clear everything away, Kevin getting more agitated with each box they moved. His roommates now gathered at the top of the stairs watching nervously. Behind all that junk was a door, just like I'd suspected, but it was different than I expected. Heavy wood reinforced with metal brackets with a padlock that looked brand new hanging from the latch. Kevin immediately said he didn't have the key, that the landlord must have locked it, that it probably just led to old heating equipment or something. The officers made him call the landlord right there, and while they waited, I noticed one of Kevin's roommates slip away upstairs, pulling out his phone as he went. The landlord arrived within 20 minutes, a nervous older man named George Hoffman who kept wiping his palms on his jeans. He fumbled with a ring of keys for what felt like forever, before finding the right one, his hands trembling as he worked the padlock. The door opened to reveal wooden stairs descending into darkness, way deeper than the basement level, with a smell coming up that made everyone step back, musty and metallic and wrong. The cops went down first with flashlights while we waited above, Kevin now completely silent, his face gray. I could hear them moving around down there, their voices echoing strangely, and then one of them shouted for everyone to get back, to not come any closer. The older officer came up the stairs fast, already on her radio calling for backup and crime scene techs, her face pale. She wouldn't tell me what they'd found, just kept saying to wait outside, that this was now an active investigation. But I heard her tell the dispatcher they'd discovered what appeared to be an old storm shelter that had been recently accessed, with evidence of blood and a single brown leather sneaker that matched the description of what Jake had been wearing. Within an hour, the entire street was blocked off with police tape, detectives, and forensic teams swarming the house. They arrested Kevin and his 3 roommates on the spot, putting them in separate patrol cars while they processed the scene. I sat on the curb across the street for hours, watching them carry evidence bags out of that house, each one making my hope drain a little more. Finally, a detective named Melissa Chen came over and sat beside me, her voice gentle as she explained what they'd pieced together so far. The storm shelter had been built in the 50s during the Cold War, a concrete bunker that previous tenants had used for storage until it was supposedly sealed off 5 years ago. But Kevin and his roommates had discovered it when they moved in, had been using it for something the detective wouldn't specify, something that required them to soundproof it and install a new ventilation system. They found evidence that someone had been held down there recently, signs of a struggle, blood on the concrete walls. Jake's shoe was there, along with his wallet and phone, which had been smashed to pieces. The detective said they were still searching, that there were other passages connected to the shelter that led to the city's old maintenance tunnels, that Jake might have escaped that way or been moved. The truth came out 3 days later when one of Kevin's roommates, a guy named Paul Morrison, broke down and told the police everything in exchange for a plea deal. They'd been using the storm shelter to run some kind of underground fighting ring, bringing drunk college kids down there to fight for money, while others bet on the outcomes. Jake had apparently stumbled onto their operation when he went looking for that exit door, had seen something he shouldn't have through a gap in the boxes. They'd panicked and grabbed him, dragged him down to the shelter to figure out what to do, but Jake had fought back harder than they expected. During the struggle, he'd managed to break free and run deeper into the tunnels, and they'd lost him in the maze of old maintenance passages. Search teams spent 2 weeks combing through those tunnels with dogs and thermal cameras, and finally found Jake about a mile from the house, alive but barely. He'd been wandering in complete darkness for 3 days, had fallen down a maintenance shaft and broken his leg, survived by drinking condensation off the pipes. He'd lost a frightening amount of weight and couldn't stop shaking for weeks afterward, but he was alive, and that's all that mattered to me. Kevin got 15 years for kidnapping and running an illegal gambling operation. His roommates got lesser sentences for their cooperation. The university shut down all parties at off-campus houses for the rest of the year, and that old house on Birch Avenue was condemned and demolished by spring. Jake spent a month in physical therapy learning to walk properly again, and another 3 months in counseling dealing with the trauma of being trapped underground in complete darkness. He never talks about what he saw in that shelter before he ran, just gets this distant look and changes the subject. We're still roommates, still best friends, but something shifted that night. We both learned how quickly a normal college party could turn into a nightmare, how the people serving you drinks might be hiding something monstrous right beneath your feet. Jake graduated last May and got a job at an accounting firm downtown, and I'm finishing up my senior year now. But neither of us goes to house parties anymore, and Jake still sleeps with a nightlight on, still checks every door in a room to make sure he knows where the exits are. Sometimes I catch him staring at nothing, rubbing that scar on his leg from where the bone broke through, and I know he's back in those tunnels, running through the darkness, trying to find his way out. Frank Dawson's Halloween displays were legendary on Cedar Ridge Drive, the kind of thing real estate agents would actually mention when showing houses in the area. Every October, he'd transform his entire front yard into something that belonged in a horror movie studio lot, not a quiet residential street in Portland. The man had mannequins so realistic that delivery drivers would refuse to walk past them after dark, preferring to leave packages at the edge of his property. His fake blood mixture had this glossy, thick consistency that never seemed to fully dry, and he'd splatter it across his driveway in patterns that looked like someone had dragged a body toward his garage. There were motion-activated screams, strobe lights hidden in the bushes, and this fog machine that would billow out thick clouds whenever someone walked by, making the whole scene look like a crime photographer's nightmare. The neighborhood had gotten used to it over the years, treating Frank's obsession like a quirky local tradition. Parents would walk their kids by during daylight hours for a safe scare. Teenagers would dare each other to touch the corpse dummy he always positioned reaching out from under his porch. And even the police had stopped responding to concerned calls from visitors who didn't know about Frank's hobby. He worked construction during the day but spent every free moment in October perfecting his setup, adding new pieces each year that he'd been crafting in his garage since January. Last year, he'd added this incredibly disturbing piece, a mannequin dressed as a jogger, sprawled across his lawn with running shoes still on, earbuds trailing from its ears, positioned like someone had attacked them mid-run. The attention to detail was unsettling. He'd even added sweat stains to the shirt and grass stains on the knees. This year, Frank started earlier than usual, hauling stuff out on October 1st instead of waiting until the second week like he normally did. I watched from my living room window as he arranged what looked like a whole crime scene across his yard. Yellow tape sectioning off areas, evidence markers next to pools of that signature fake blood, and bodies positioned at weird angles all over the grass. But something about this year's main centerpiece made me stop mid-sip of my morning coffee. Right in the middle of his lawn, illuminated by a spotlight he'd installed, was a man in a business suit, face down with one arm stretched toward the sidewalk like he'd been trying to crawl away. The suit was navy blue with subtle pinstripes, the kind you'd see at any downtown office, and there was a briefcase spilled open near the body with papers scattered around it. Frank had even added a coffee cup on its side, dark liquid staining the papers brown. The thing that really got me was how fresh everything looked. Usually, Frank's props had this theatrical quality, obviously fake even when they were well made. But this businessman dummy looked different. The suit fabric had natural wrinkles where the body was positioned. The leather shoes had scuff marks on the soles, and when the wind picked up, I swear I saw the jacket flutter in a way that seemed too natural for a stuffed mannequin. Frank spent hours adjusting the scene, moving the briefcase a few inches here, repositioning the papers there, stepping back to examine his work like an artist with a canvas. When he finally went inside that evening, I found myself staring at that suited figure for longer than I should have, trying to figure out what exactly made it so much more convincing than his previous displays. By day 3, the smell started. At first I thought maybe Frank had gone overboard with some kind of rotting food effect, trying to add another sensory element to his display. The October heat wave we were having, temperatures pushing into the mid-70s when they should have been in the 50s, wasn't helping. That sweet, heavy odor would drift across my yard whenever the wind shifted, making me close my windows despite the warm weather. I saw other neighbors doing the same thing, Mrs. Kalinsky from 2 houses down actually came over to ask if I knew what Frank was using this year. That stank so bad. Her beagle wouldn't even walk past Frank's house anymore, pulling against his leash and whining whenever she tried to take him that direction. The mailman started leaving Frank's mail at the end of his driveway, instead of walking up to the door slot. Frank didn't seem to notice or care about the smell. Every evening he'd come out with a beer, sit on his porch steps, and admire his handiwork like nothing was wrong. He'd wave at anyone who passed by, that proud grin on his face, completely oblivious to how people were starting to speed walk past his property with their shirts pulled up over their noses. On October 4th, I finally went over to talk to him about it, catching him as he was adjusting some of the scattered papers around the businessman dummy. The smell hit me like a physical wall when I got within 10 feet of the display. It was that thick, cloying stench that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Nothing like the artificial Halloween scents they sold at party stores. Frank just laughed when I mentioned it, said he'd found some new decomposition spray online that was supposed to be super realistic, military-grade stuff that crime scene cleanup crews used for training. Standing that close to the businessman prop, I noticed other details that made my skin prickle. There was a wedding ring on the left hand, one of those tungsten bands that were popular a few years back, and a watch that was still ticking. I could see the second hand moving through the crystal face. The hair looked real too, not that synthetic Halloween store stuff, but actual human hair with gray streaks at the temples, individual strands moving in the breeze. When I mentioned how incredibly realistic it looked, Frank got this weird expression, almost confused, and said he hadn't added any new props this year, just rearranged his old ones better. That didn't make sense because I'd never seen this particular dummy before, and I'd been watching Frank set up his displays for 5 years straight. He brushed off my questions and went back to arranging his scene, but I noticed he kept glancing at the businessman prop with this puzzled look, like he was trying to remember where it came from. That night I couldn't sleep, partly from the smell that was somehow getting stronger, and partly from a nagging feeling in my gut. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and looked out my bedroom window at Frank's yard. The streetlight cast long shadows across his display, and I could see the businessman prop clearly from my second-floor view. Maybe it was my tired eyes playing tricks, but I swear the position looked different from earlier. The outstretched arm seemed to have moved a few inches closer to the sidewalk. I grabbed my phone and took a picture, telling myself I was being paranoid but wanting some kind of proof. The next morning, I compared the photo to what I was seeing, and sure enough, the arm had definitely shifted. When I saw Frank that afternoon getting his mail, I asked if he'd been adjusting the display during the night. He looked at me like I was crazy and said he hadn't touched anything since yesterday evening. Why would he be messing with it at 2 in the morning? October 5th was when things really went sideways. I was grading papers at my kitchen table when I heard this commotion outside. Dogs barking like crazy, car doors slamming, voices shouting. Through my window, I saw Mrs. Kalinsky's beagle had gotten loose and run straight into Frank's yard, going right for the businessman display. The dog was pawing at the figure, whimpering and barking, trying to grab something with its teeth. Mrs. Kalinsky was screaming for her dog to come back, but she wouldn't step foot on Frank's property. Frank came running out of his house yelling at the dog to get away from his display, but when he got close enough to grab the beagle's collar, he suddenly stopped dead. The color drained from his face as he stared down at what the dog had been pawing at, a wallet that had fallen out of the businessman's pocket. Frank picked it up with trembling fingers, opened it, and I could see him mouth the words, "Oh God," over and over as he looked at whatever ID was inside. The police arrived within 20 minutes of Frank's call. Not just one patrol car, but 3, then a van, then people in different uniforms who started putting up actual crime scene tape that looked exactly like Frank's fake ones. They cleared everyone back, wouldn't let anyone get close, but from my porch I could hear fragments of their radio chatter. "Missing person," they kept saying. Robert Henley, local insurance adjuster, hadn't come home from work 6 days ago. His wife had reported him missing on October 2nd, said he'd left the office like normal but never made it home. The way the cops were looking at Frank, taking pictures of his entire display, measuring distances between props, it was clear they thought he'd done something. Frank kept shaking his head, explaining over and over that he'd found all his mannequins already positioned when he started setting up on October 1st, assumed someone had played an early Halloween prank by adding extra props to his collection in the night. He swore he thought it was just another dummy, maybe one that someone didn't want anymore and figured he'd appreciate. The coroner confirmed what the smell had been telling us all along. Robert Henley had been dead for approximately 6 days, likely killed elsewhere and deliberately placed in Frank's yard sometime during the night of September 30th. The real kicker came when detectives found security footage from the house 3 doors down that had a partial view of Frank's yard. The grainy video showed a van pulling up around 3 in the morning on October 1st, someone in dark clothes dragging something heavy across Frank's lawn, spending about 15 minutes arranging it among the Halloween decorations that Frank had left out from the previous year. The person knew exactly what they were doing, positioning the body to blend in perfectly with Frank's signature style. They'd even scattered fake evidence markers around to make it look like part of the scene. The detective told me later that whoever did it had probably been watching Frank's displays for years, knew his patterns, knew he'd start setting up on October 1st, and wouldn't look too closely at what was already there. They never did catch who did it. The van was stolen, found burned out 2 counties over a week later. Robert Henley's murder became one of those cases that goes cold after all the leads dry up. No enemies anyone knew about, no life insurance policies worth killing for, no affairs or gambling debts. Just a regular guy who sold insurance and coached Little League on weekends, whose body ended up as part of a Halloween display for 5 days before anyone realized. Frank took down all his decorations the day after the police finished processing his yard. Not just for that year, but permanently. I helped him haul boxes to the dump, watched him throw away thousands of dollars worth of props he'd collected over the years. He couldn't stand to look at any of it anymore, he said. Moved away 3 months later. Heard he went to Arizona where Halloween's not such a big deal. The new family that bought his house has no idea why nobody on our street really decorates for Halloween anymore. Why we all just leave our porch lights off and pretend we're not home when October 31st rolls around. Some things just kill the spirit of a holiday, you know. And every time I smell that particular sick sweet smell, whether it's roadkill or spoiled meat or whatever, I'm right back there, watching Frank realize that he'd been tending to a corpse for 5 days, adjusting its position, stepping around it with his morning coffee, proud of how realistic his display looked this year. Every house on Oakwood Drive had security cameras installed after the break-ins 2 summers ago, which is why what happened that night got captured from so many different angles. Living alone since my divorce, I'd gotten into a predictable rhythm. Warehouse job at the distribution center outside Madison, Wisconsin. Late shifts that ended at midnight. Same route home 5 nights a week. 32 isn't old, but it's old enough to appreciate a quiet routine, especially after the chaos of a messy split. That Halloween fell on a Tuesday in 2017, and the guys at work had decorated the loading dock with those cheap plastic skeletons that glow in the dark. We shared fun-size candy bars during our breaks, complained about the new scanning system that kept freezing up, and made the usual jokes about being stuck at work while kids were out collecting candy by the pillowcase full. Normal night, normal conversations, normal everything right up until I clocked out at 12:03 and headed to my car in the employee parking lot. Madison gets quiet after midnight, but that drive home felt like traveling through a ghost town. And I don't mean that in the Halloween decoration sense. The university district usually has at least a few drunk students wandering around, especially on Halloween, but the streets were completely empty. Not just empty, but wrong somehow. Like everyone had gotten some memo I'd missed about staying indoors. The 20-minute drive felt longer with no other cars on the road. Just me and my headlights cutting through patches of fog that had rolled in from the lakes. Every house I passed still had porch lights burning bright, those universal Halloween signals that candy was available, except it was way too late for any kid to still be out. The McDonald's on Miller Road sat dark. The gas station that never closes had its pumps shut off. Even the police car that usually sits at the speed trap near the industrial park was nowhere to be seen. By the time I turned onto my street, my brain was trying to rationalize it all. Maybe there was some big event downtown I hadn't heard about. Maybe the weather forecast had warned about storms. Maybe I was just tired and overthinking everything. My driveway is one of those long gravel types that curves slightly, about 40 feet from the street to my garage, lined with these overgrown juniper bushes the previous owner planted in the 90s. As my headlights swept across the gravel, illuminating the path ahead, 2 figures came into view at the very end of my driveway, right where it meets the sidewalk. They were just standing there, perfectly still, facing my direction. Both wore those vintage clown masks, not the cheap plastic ones from party stores, but those old-school rubber ones with the wild orange hair, huge red noses, and painted smiles that stretched way too wide. One was notably taller, maybe 6'3", wearing what looked like a mechanic's coveralls splattered with dark stains. The shorter one, probably 5'8" or 5'9", had on a faded yellow raincoat despite the fact it hadn't rained in weeks. They weren't moving, weren't talking, just standing there like mannequins somebody had placed at the end of my driveway as the world's worst Halloween prank. My first thought was college kids being idiots, because Madison is full of them and Halloween brings out their worst judgment. I actually laughed a little, reaching for my phone to maybe snap a picture for my buddies at work. Check out these morons trying to scare me. But as I got closer, my headlights lit them up better, and that's when I noticed what the taller one was holding. Down by his side, gripped in his right hand like it weighed nothing, was a sledgehammer. Not a prop, not some foam Halloween decoration, but an actual sledgehammer with a worn wooden handle and a head that had seen some serious use. The shorter one's hands were empty, but stayed weirdly positioned at stomach level, fingers spread wide like they were pressing against invisible glass. Neither of them reacted to my car approaching, didn't shield their eyes from the headlights, didn't shift their weight or adjust their stance. They just kept staring through those mask eye holes, and even from inside my car, I could see their actual eyes behind the rubber, wide open, unblinking, focused directly on me. I stopped my car about 15 feet from them, engine running, doors locked without even thinking about it. The rational part of my brain kept insisting this was just an elaborate prank, but my gut was screaming something completely different. These weren't drunk college kids trying to get a reaction. There was something methodical about how they stood, something practiced and deliberate. I hit my high beams, flooding them with even more light. And still nothing. No flinch, no movement, just that horrible stillness. That's when I noticed other details that made my mouth go dry. The taller one's coveralls had fresh mud on the knees, like he'd been kneeling in dirt recently. The sledgehammer had something dark and wet on its head that definitely wasn't rust. The shorter one's raincoat had tears along the bottom, 3 parallel rips like something had clawed at it. My hand fumbled for my phone, nearly dropping it as I tried to dial 911 while keeping my eyes on them. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. A woman's voice, calm and professional, asking about my emergency. "There are 2 people in clown masks blocking my driveway," I said, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "One of them has a sledgehammer. They're just standing there, not moving, and I'm trapped in my car." The dispatcher asked for my address, which I rattled off quickly, then asked if I was in immediate danger. Before I could answer, both clowns tilted their heads to the left at exactly the same moment, like synchronized swimmers performing some twisted routine. The movement was so sudden and coordinated that I actually jumped in my seat, my knee hitting the steering wheel. "They're moving," I said into the phone, hearing my voice crack this time. "Please send someone now." The dispatcher told me units were on the way, stay in the vehicle, keep the doors locked, and stay on the line. She asked me to describe what they were doing, but I could barely process it myself. The taller one had started tapping the sledgehammer against his palm, slow, rhythmic taps that I could actually hear through my closed windows. The shorter one began doing this weird swaying motion, shifting weight from foot to foot like a boxer warming up, those spread fingers finally curling into fists. Then they started walking toward my car. Not running, not rushing, just walking with these measured, deliberate steps that somehow felt more threatening than if they'd charged at me. The dispatcher kept asking what was happening, and I kept narrating like some twisted play-by-play announcer, but my voice was getting higher, tighter. "They're coming closer, maybe 10 feet away now. The tall one is raising the hammer." That's when I threw the car in reverse, tires spinning on the gravel, backing up fast toward the street. But here's the thing about my driveway. It curves, and backing up at night when you're panicking isn't exactly precision driving. I clipped one of those juniper bushes, felt the car lurch, overcorrected, and ended up with my back wheels in the grass of my front yard. The engine stalled. In that sudden silence, I could hear them crunching across the gravel, getting closer, and the dispatcher saying something about units being 3 minutes out. But 3 minutes felt like 3 hours when those masks were reflecting in my mirrors. I got the engine started again just as the sledgehammer came down on my hood. The sound was incredible. This metallic crash that made my ears ring left a dent the size of a dinner plate right in front of me. The shorter one pressed both palms flat against my driver's side window, and I could see every detail of those hands through the glass. Dirt under the fingernails, scratches across the knuckles, a gold wedding band on the left ring finger that somehow made everything worse because it made them human, real, not just Halloween decorations come to life. They started dragging their hands down the window, leaving these greasy smears, and that's when I heard it, laughing. Not maniacal movie villain laughing, but this low, satisfied chuckle coming from behind both masks. I gunned it backward again, heard them stumble away from the car, managed to get onto the street properly this time. The dispatcher was asking if I was okay, if I could drive to the police station, but I wasn't leaving my property to these psychos. I pulled across the street into Harold's driveway, the neighbor with all the decorations, and kept my headlights pointed at my house, engine running, ready to bolt if they came after me. From Harold's driveway, I watched them through my windshield, the dispatcher still on speakerphone asking for updates every few seconds. The 2 clowns stood in my yard for a moment, looking at each other like they were having some silent conversation. Then the shorter one walked over to my mailbox, this sturdy metal thing my ex-wife insisted we needed, and the taller one followed. Without any hesitation, the tall one swung that sledgehammer in a perfect arc and demolished the mailbox post in 2 hits. The whole thing toppled over into the street with this hollow clang that echoed through the neighborhood, but nobody came out to look. Not Harold, whose house I was parked in front of. Not the Andersons next door with their new baby who usually woke up at every little noise. Not even Doug from 2 houses over who worked security and always kept watch on the street. Every house stayed dark and quiet except for those porch lights, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The clowns started walking down the street, not hurrying, that same measured pace, and they stopped at the Andersons' driveway. What happened next still makes me sick to think about. The shorter one produced something from that yellow raincoat, a screwdriver maybe 8 inches long, and went straight for the Andersons' minivan tires. 4 quick, efficient punctures, 1 for each tire, the hissing sound carrying all the way to where I sat. The taller one took the sledgehammer to their garden gnomes, these silly things Jennifer Anderson had collected for years, pulverizing each one into ceramic dust with single swings. They moved to Doug's house next, and I watched the tall one cave in the windshield of his pickup truck, while the shorter one did something to his porch I couldn't quite see. The dispatcher kept saying units were almost there, 1 minute out, but these 2 were working their way down the street like they had all the time in the world. Every few houses they'd stop, look back at me still sitting in Harold's driveway with my lights on, and do that synchronized head tilt again. They wanted me to watch. This whole thing, whatever it was, they wanted me to see it all. The worst part was how quiet they were. No whooping or yelling or typical vandalism noise, just the sounds of destruction and those occasional low chuckles that drifted across the night air. Finally, I saw the blue and red lights coming down the street. 2 squad cars, no sirens but lights flashing, moving fast. The clowns saw them too. They were standing in front of the Thompsons' house about 6 houses down from mine, and when those lights appeared, they just stopped. Didn't run, didn't panic, just stood there facing the approaching police cars. The cops pulled up, blocking them in, officers getting out with hands on their weapons, shouting commands I couldn't quite hear from where I sat. The 2 clowns raised their hands slowly, the tall one still holding that sledgehammer until an officer yelled at him to drop it. It fell to the pavement with a clang that seemed to break whatever spell had been hanging over the neighborhood. Suddenly, porch lights were flicking on. People were coming out of their houses in robes and pajamas, everyone talking at once. Harold came running out to his driveway where I was still parked, asking what the hell was going on, why I was there, what happened to my car. I couldn't even answer him properly, just pointed at the cops putting handcuffs on the 2 figures who were still wearing those horrible masks. The police took my statement that night, then again the next morning at the station. The 2 men in the clown masks were brothers from Beloit, about 40 minutes away, Tommy and Carl Bradshaw, ages 26 and 29. They'd driven up to Madison with a trunk full of tools and no explanation that made any sense. When the cops asked them why they did it, why they picked my street, why they stood at my driveway first, they wouldn't say a word. Just sat there in interrogation, no lawyers, no demands, completely silent. The detective told me they found my address written on a piece of paper in their car, along with 3 other addresses in different Wisconsin towns, but no connection between any of us. No mutual friends, no shared workplaces, nothing. They both pled guilty to vandalism, property destruction, and menacing. Got 18 months each, served 8. I never found out why they came to Oakwood Drive that night, why they waited at my driveway, why they wanted me specifically to watch what they did. The security footage from all those houses, including mine, showed them arriving at exactly 11:47, standing at the end of my driveway for 13 minutes before I got home, never moving, never checking phones, just waiting. Sometimes I still dream about those masks, those synchronized head tilts, that wedding ring catching the light. I moved out of that house 3 months later, got an apartment closer to work, one with a parking garage and a doorman. But every Halloween, when I see kids in clown costumes or those decorative masks in store windows, I remember that night and wonder if Tommy and Carl Bradshaw are out there somewhere, maybe wearing different masks this time, standing at the end of someone else's driveway. The last kid showed up at my door dressed as some character from a video game I didn't recognize, and I dumped the rest of my candy bars into his pillowcase just to be done with it. My feet were killing me from standing at the door for 3 hours straight, and the inflatable dinosaur costume I'd been wearing was making me sweat like crazy. After locking up and turning off the porch light, I collapsed on the couch and pulled out my phone to order food. The fridge had nothing but expired yogurt and beer, and Antonio's was the only pizza place still delivering this late on Halloween. Their app was acting weird, taking forever to load, but eventually my order went through. Large pepperoni, garlic knots, and a 2-liter of Coke. 45 minutes, the confirmation said. I peeled off that ridiculous dinosaur suit and grabbed a shower while I waited, figuring I had plenty of time. The doorbell rang right as I was pulling a shirt over my head, still damp from the shower. Through the peephole, I could make out a tall figure in a cracked skull mask holding what looked like a pizza bag. Nothing unusual for Halloween night. I'd seen 3 delivery drivers earlier wearing costumes while I was handing out candy. But when I opened the door, the guy just stood there, completely silent, his head cocked at this weird angle like he was examining me through those hollow eye sockets. The pizza bag in his hands was plain black. No logo or anything. Not the red insulated ones with Antonio's name that I'd seen dozens of times before. He was wearing a faded leather jacket over a black hoodie, and I noticed his jeans had dark stains on them, maybe grease or mud. After what felt like way too long, he finally spoke in this rough whisper that barely sounded human, saying $24.50 for the order. I handed him $30 and told him to keep the change, just wanting this interaction to end. But instead of leaving right away, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out this crumpled receipt, smoothing it against his thigh before handing it to me. His fingers were covered in these thick work gloves, the kind mechanics wear, with something dark caked under the fingernails. The receipt was just a plain white slip with my order typed out in basic computer font. No Antonio's header, no phone number, no address, nothing. When I looked up to ask about it, he was already walking away, but not toward any car I could see in my driveway. There was this beat-up gray sedan parked across the street that I'd never seen before. No delivery sign on top, no company stickers anywhere. He climbed in and just sat there for a minute with the engine off, and I could swear he was still watching my house through that cracked skull mask. The pizza tasted fine, maybe a little cold, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling while I ate. About 20 minutes later, I heard something outside. Not loud, just this subtle scraping sound like someone dragging something across concrete. My backyard motion light clicked on, flooding the patio with harsh white light. But from the kitchen window, I couldn't see anything out there. Then it clicked off after 30 seconds, the way it's supposed to, leaving everything dark again. I grabbed a flashlight from the junk drawer and went to check the back door, making sure it was locked. And that's when I noticed the doorknob was wet, like someone had just tried turning it with damp hands. The scraping sound came again, closer this time, from the side of the house where I keep the trash cans. My neighbor's dog started going absolutely crazy, barking and snarling in a way I'd never heard from that usually friendly golden retriever. I killed all the lights in my house and moved to the living room window, peeking through the blinds at the street. That gray sedan was gone, but I could see fresh tire marks in the wet leaves where it had been parked. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I kept the flashlight gripped tight in my sweaty palm. Then I saw him, or at least I think it was him, standing at the far edge of my property line, just barely visible under the streetlight. Same height, same leather jacket, but the skull mask was gone, replaced by what looked like a plain black ski mask. He was holding something in his right hand, maybe a crowbar or a tire iron, just standing there perfectly still like he was waiting for something. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my screen was frozen on the Antonio's app, showing my order as still pending, like I'd never received anything at all. The sound of breaking glass from my basement window sent me into full panic mode. I could hear footsteps down there, slow and deliberate, testing each stair to avoid the creaky spots like someone who'd been listening and learning. My phone finally unfroze, and I managed to dial 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher while barricading myself in the upstairs bathroom. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs to the main floor, and I heard him trying the basement door that led to my kitchen. Thank God I'd installed that deadbolt last summer. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm, that units were on the way, but all I could focus on was the sound of metal scraping against metal as he worked on that lock. Then suddenly, complete silence. No footsteps, no scraping, nothing. Just me breathing hard in that tiny bathroom, sitting in the bathtub with a baseball bat I'd grabbed from my bedroom. The police siren started wailing in the distance, getting louder by the second, and I heard rapid footsteps running through my basement toward the broken window. By the time the cops got there, maybe 3 minutes later, he was long gone, leaving only muddy boot prints across my basement floor and scratches all over the deadbolt. The officers swept through my house with their guns drawn while I waited outside with a blanket around my shoulders, feeling like I was in some crime show. One of them, Officer Daniels, came out holding an evidence bag with that crumpled receipt I'd left on my kitchen counter. He asked me to confirm the name of the pizza place, and when I told him Antonio's, he got this concerned look on his face. Turns out, they'd called the restaurant. Antonio's had no record of my order, no driver working that night matching my description, and their last delivery had gone out at 9:15, over an hour before my pizza arrived. They found more evidence over the next hour that made everything worse. My security camera, which I'd honestly forgotten was even working, had captured the whole thing in grainy black and white footage. The guy had been circling my house for at least 30 minutes before ringing the doorbell, trying every window, checking every door, even lifting up my garage door a few inches to peer inside. At one point in the footage, he stood directly under the camera and looked up, that skull mask filling the entire frame, like he wanted me to know he knew it was there. The investigators found something else too, a receipt from a hardware store time-stamped from that afternoon, blown against my fence for items including work gloves, a crowbar, and zip ties. The cop showing me the footage pointed out something I hadn't noticed. In several frames, you could see another person sitting in that gray sedan. Just a shadow, really, but definitely someone else involved in whatever this was supposed to be. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Rivera with tired eyes and coffee stains on her blazer, sat me down and explained what they thought had happened. These guys had been hitting houses all through October, using food delivery as a cover to scope out potential targets. They'd watch for people living alone, figure out their routines, then come back later for a home invasion. The Halloween angle was new though. With everyone wearing masks and costumes, nobody would think twice about a delivery driver in a skull mask. She showed me reports from 3 other neighborhoods where similar things had happened, though I was the only one where they'd actually tried to break in that same night. The pizza was real, she explained, probably from some cheap place across town, just to make the interaction seem legitimate enough that victims wouldn't immediately call the cops. What really got to me was when she mentioned they'd found similar boot prints at another house 2 streets over, where an elderly man had ordered Chinese food around 8 that same night. Officer Daniels came back with more questions and a laptop showing mugshots, asking if any of the faces looked familiar. But how could I tell when the guy never took off his mask? They had me walk through everything 3 more times, and each telling made me remember new details. The way he tilted his head when studying my house, how his breathing sounded labored through the mask, the chemical smell coming off his clothes like motor oil mixed with something else. Around 2 in the morning, after they'd photographed everything and taken the receipt as evidence, Rivera told me they'd be increasing patrols in the area, but suggested I might want to stay somewhere else for a few nights. My sister lived 40 minutes away in Terre Haute, and I called her from the police station parking lot, my voice shaking as I tried to explain why I needed to crash at her place without completely freaking her out about what had just happened. I stayed at my sister's place for a week, barely sleeping, jumping at every doorbell and delivery truck that passed by. When I finally went back home, I installed a new security system with cameras covering every angle, motion sensors that could detect a mouse, and one of those video doorbells that lets you see who's there from your phone. The police never caught those guys, at least not that they told me about, but the break-ins stopped after Halloween, just vanished like they'd never happened. Rivera called me 2 weeks later to say they'd found the gray sedan abandoned in a parking garage downtown, completely cleaned out except for a stack of fake receipts from various restaurants and a box of those cheap skull masks you can buy at any costume shop. The worst part was finding out from my neighbor months later that he'd seen someone in his backyard that same night, trying his shed door, but figured it was just drunk teenagers playing Halloween pranks and didn't call anyone about it. Even now, years later, I don't order delivery to my house anymore. I always pick it up myself or meet drivers at the gas station down the street where there are lights and cameras everywhere. Every Halloween when the doorbell rings, even when I can see it's clearly just kids in superhero costumes, my chest gets tight and I have to take a deep breath before opening the door. The detective was probably right about it being some organized crew that moved on to another city, but sometimes I wonder if that guy in the skull mask drives past my house occasionally, remembering the one that got away, maybe waiting for me to let my guard down and order another pizza on some random night. I keep that baseball bat next to my bed now, and I've gotten really good at recognizing the sound of every normal creak and settling noise my house makes, so I'll know immediately if something's actually wrong. The funny thing is, I found out later that Antonio's had actually closed at 9 that night due to their oven breaking down, which means whoever brought me that pizza had gone through the trouble of getting one from somewhere else, just to make their twisted plan work. It was one of those chilly late October evenings when the air smelled like wet leaves and pumpkin candles. My parents were both working the night shift that Halloween, so it was just me and my little brother Caleb. He was 8, dressed as a vampire with fake fangs that kept falling out, while I wore a cheap witch hat and an oversized sweater. Our neighborhood wasn't fancy, but people went all out with decorations, fake cobwebs in bushes, orange lights hanging from porches, and skeletons swaying from trees. It felt safe, familiar. I'd walked those streets my whole life, and I thought I knew everyone who lived there. We started around 6 when the sky was still a faded purple, and kids were running from door to door with plastic pumpkins. I remember how Caleb kept tugging on my sleeve, pointing at every house that had a fog machine or a motion-activated ghost. Everything felt normal, until I noticed the white van parked across from the Hendersons' house. No decorations, no logo, just plain white. The windows were tinted darker than usual, and I could barely make out if someone was inside. I told myself it was probably just a neighbor's friend, maybe someone visiting for the holiday. But about 20 minutes later, when we turned onto Willowbrook Lane, there it was again. Same white van, same spot near the corner. I laughed nervously and said something to Caleb about how funny it was that the same car kept following our route, but he didn't even look up. He was too busy counting his candy. I tried not to think about it, but my mind started piecing things together. The van hadn't passed us yet. Somehow it always ended up one street ahead. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe there were 2 vans that looked alike. By the time we reached the last few houses, most of the little kids had gone home, and the streets were quieter. Porch lights flickered on and off as people ran out of candy. That's when I saw the van again, parked halfway down Birchwood Court, its headlights off. It was angled slightly toward us, like it had stopped mid-turn. I held Caleb's hand tighter and said we were heading home. He groaned, saying he still wanted to hit just one more house, but I didn't answer. Something about that van, the stillness of it, the way it seemed to wait, made the back of my neck sting with cold air. When we reached our house, the porch light was still on, and I felt this wave of relief wash over me. Caleb ran ahead, already planning to dump his candy on the living room floor. I glanced back one last time before stepping inside, and the van rolled slowly past the corner, its headlights off again. It didn't stop, didn't speed up, just drifted by like it was scanning the neighborhood. I stood there until it disappeared behind the trees, pretending to check my phone so Caleb wouldn't see I was nervous. Dad came home not long after. He's the kind of person who keeps everything organized, from our bills to the neighborhood watch schedule. I told him about the van right away, expecting him to brush it off, but instead he frowned and went straight to his laptop. Our neighborhood has a shared camera system. Every few houses, someone has a motion-activated feed connected to a shared network. Dad started pulling up footage from earlier that evening, clicking through the timestamps as I stood beside him. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. We saw the van the first time, parked near the Hendersons. Then again on Willowbrook Lane, again on Birchwood Court. Each time it stopped for several minutes, lights off, before moving to the next street. Dad zoomed in on the license plate, but it was too blurry to read. He replayed one clip in slow motion, and we both saw a shadow inside the driver's seat. Someone tall, wearing what looked like a baseball cap. No movement, just sitting there waiting. Dad called the non-emergency police line, gave them the footage, and they said they'd send someone to check it out. While he was on the phone, I went to Caleb's room to tell him everything was fine, but when I looked out his window, I saw the van again, parked 3 houses down. This time, the headlights were on, faintly glowing against the pavement. The figure inside wasn't moving, but I could tell whoever it was facing our house. I shut the blinds without saying a word. The police arrived about half an hour later, 2 officers in uniform who walked the street with flashlights. By then, the van was gone. They took Dad's statement, copied the footage onto a USB drive, and told us they'd file a report. One of them said something about how Halloween nights always attract weird traffic, but I could tell from the look they exchanged that they took it seriously. They left their card and promised to follow up. That night, I barely slept. Every time a car passed, the sound of tires on wet asphalt made me sit up and check the window. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat was full of messages. 3 different parents had seen the same van. One said it had stopped outside their driveway while their kids were out front. Another claimed the driver rolled down the window and called something out before speeding off. People started sharing their own camera footage, and by noon, the van had been spotted across several streets. A few of the recordings even showed it stopping near kids walking alone. None of us could make out the driver's face. 2 days later, Dad got a call from a detective. They confirmed the van matched the description of one used in an attempted child abduction 2 towns away. Same make, same dented rear door, same partial license plate. They said the suspect hadn't been caught yet but was being tracked. When Dad told me, I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at Caleb's candy bucket still half full, realizing how close we might have been to something terrible. It's the kind of thing you never expect to touch your family until it does. Even now, years later, every Halloween feels different. I still walk Caleb, well, not so little anymore, around the block. But I catch myself scanning every car that passes. I know most people out there are harmless, just living their lives. But that night taught me something I can't unlearn. Sometimes the real monsters don't wear masks, and they're not inside haunted houses. They're parked quietly on the corner, waiting for you to stop paying attention. There are moments in life that carve themselves into your memory like scars, and that night became one of them for me. I had planned it for weeks, just a simple Halloween night with my son, Miles. He was 8, full of energy, and had been talking for days about dressing as a pirate. We lived in a quiet suburb where everyone knew each other, the kind of place where people waved from their driveways and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. I remember tightening the strap of his plastic sword before we left, his small hands clutching the candy bucket shaped like a pumpkin. The air smelled like wet leaves and cheap fog machine smoke. Every porch flickered orange, and the whole neighborhood glowed with that soft excitement only Halloween brings. We walked house to house, laughing when Miles tripped over his costume or shouted "thank you" through his plastic mask. He was proud of how heavy his bucket had gotten. At some point, We joined a small group of families moving down the main street. Kids darting between lawns, parents chatting behind them. Everything felt safe, almost too perfect. It happened when we reached the corner house with the strobe lights and fake tombstones. I turned to greet one of the neighbors, a man I'd seen walking his dog a few times. And in that brief turn, Miles was gone. I called his name, expecting him to pop out from behind a bush or jump scare me like he loved to do. When he didn't answer, the laughter around me blurred into background noise. I checked the yard, then the sidewalk, then ran toward the end of the street. He was nowhere. His candy bucket lay tipped over near the curb, candy scattered across the wet grass. I started asking around, parents, kids, anyone. Most of them shook their heads, saying they hadn't noticed him wander off. But one woman mentioned seeing a firefighter leading a little boy toward a white SUV. She thought it was just a parent helping their kid get home early. I ran down the block, searching for the vehicle, but the street was crowded, headlights flashing everywhere. By the time the police arrived, the neighborhood had gone quiet, and the house where we'd stopped, the one with the fake tombstones, had its lights off. The officers asked me to describe exactly what I saw, and I kept repeating the same useless details: the flashing strobe lights, the fake fog, the sound of kids laughing. I pointed to the house, insisting that was where we had been standing. But when they checked, the place looked completely different. The decorations were gone, the porch was dark, and the windows were covered with wooden boards that looked like they had been there for years. I remember standing there completely confused, as if the whole setup had been erased in minutes. The officer shone his flashlight on the ground where Miles's candy had spilled, and the reflection of the wrappers looked almost metallic under the beam. They questioned every neighbor on that street, but nobody could say who lived in that house. One man swore it had been vacant since he moved there, and another said it used to belong to an elderly couple who'd passed away years ago. No one had seen anyone move in or out recently. When they pulled up property records, there wasn't even a registered address matching that spot anymore. It was just listed as a lot, with no dwelling number. The more the police checked, the more everything stopped making sense. I stayed out until dawn, calling his name until my voice cracked. Every shadow looked like him for a second. Every distant laugh made my heart leap. The officers promised to keep searching, but as the days passed, their updates became shorter, less hopeful. They found no tire marks matching an SUV, no security footage that captured a firefighter costume, and no candy wrappers from the brand Miles loved near the area where I found his bucket. It was as if the night had swallowed him whole. Weeks later, I started walking that same route every evening after work. The house was still there, or what looked like a version of it. The boards, the empty porch, the uneven lawn. But every now and then I'd see something out of place, a faint orange glow behind one of the boarded windows, or the flicker of a strobe light for half a second before it vanished. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined that house. One night near the end of that month, I parked across from the empty lot and just sat there with the engine off. The street was silent except for the hum of distant traffic. Then, right around the same hour when Miles disappeared, the porch light came on. It was faint, like a bulb struggling to stay alive, but it was there. The fog drifted across the yard exactly the way it had that night. I got out of the car and walked closer, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. From the sidewalk, I could hear faint laughter inside the house. Kids' voices, giggling, echoing through the boards. When I called out, everything stopped. No sound, no light, just the cold air moving through the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever before forcing myself to leave. The next morning I returned with an officer, but the house was gone again. Just grass and dirt where it had stood hours earlier. He told me to take a break from the area, said grief can twist perception, but I wasn't confused. I knew where I had been. I knew what I saw. Months later, a neighbor I barely knew slipped a small object into my mailbox. A plastic pirate sword, broken near the handle. The same cheap kind I had tightened for Miles that night. No note, no explanation. I called the police, but they couldn't trace who left it. They said maybe it was someone's idea of a cruel prank. I stopped pushing after that. I stopped talking about it altogether. It has been years now, and Halloween still makes me uneasy. Every October, I think about that flickering porch light and the laughter behind those boarded windows. Sometimes I drive through the old neighborhood, half hoping to see that house again, half dreading it. No one ever found Miles, and no one ever found that white SUV. But some nights I swear I can still hear his voice, faint and distant, calling from somewhere down that same street, asking if we can visit just one more house. The night air carried that mix of cold and leftover smoke from bonfires people light around Halloween. I had spent the evening at a small get-together hosted by an old college friend, someone who still thought themed costumes were mandatory no matter how old we got. By the time I left, it was past midnight, and the roads were almost empty. The party had been out in a rural area where the highway cuts through long stretches of pine and farmland, the kind of place where your headlights feel like the only thing keeping the darkness from swallowing the world. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No cars, no music, just the hum of my tires against the pavement. A few miles down, I saw red and blue flashes reflecting off the trees ahead. My first thought was that there'd been an accident or maybe a drunk driving checkpoint since it was Halloween night. As I slowed, I could make out two figures in reflective jackets standing near orange cones. A patrol car parked slightly crooked on the shoulder with its lights spinning. One of the men motioned for me to pull over. His hand movements were quick, almost impatient, and I remember how oddly close the other figure stood to him, not really doing anything, just watching. I rolled down my window halfway and greeted the one who approached. He leaned down and asked for my license in a tone that was polite, but clipped, like someone repeating a rehearsed line. Something about his voice didn't match the badge glinting under the lights. It sounded too young. When I handed over my license, his flashlight swept through the car interior longer than necessary, pausing on the passenger seat. Behind him, the second man was pacing, not really paying attention to the supposed checkpoint duties, just circling slowly, boots crunching gravel. Except they weren't boots. When he stepped closer, the reflective light caught white sneakers. That small detail sank in slower than it should have. I glanced at the patrol car again, noticing how its paint looked duller, like an old vehicle that had been resprayed. The markings seemed slightly off, too close together. My nerves prickled and I started to ask which department they were from, but before I could finish, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, bright, steady, moving fast. A second later, the sound of a real siren cut through the night. The man holding my license froze for a second, then suddenly turned and shouted something I couldn't make out. Both of them bolted toward the tree line, disappearing into the woods, as the new cruiser rolled up behind me. The real officer who stepped out of the cruiser was older, with a calm expression that didn't match the chaos I'd just witnessed. He asked me to keep my hands visible, and then approached cautiously, flashlight steady. I told him what had happened, how two men had stopped me and taken my license before running off. He immediately called something into his radio and told me to stay in the car. More patrol cars started arriving within minutes, their lights bouncing off the trees like some kind of eerie warning. One of the officers shined a light into the woods, revealing a narrow trail of footprints heading downhill toward a creek. When they found my license, it was lying near the cones, half buried in the gravel, along with a few others. There were at least 5 IDs scattered around, a pair of zip ties, and what looked like an imitation badge. The fake patrol car turned out to be an old sedan painted over with magnetic decals that peeled when the officers touched them. It made my skin crawl to think how easily they could have fooled someone else. If the real cruiser had not shown up, I had no idea what those men were planning to do. The thought kept looping in my head while I waited inside my car, engine still running, heat blowing through the vents. They asked if I could describe the men, but all I could really say was that one was tall with a shaved head, and the other had a heavy build, wearing that ridiculous pair of sneakers. Both wore jackets with reflective strips, but they didn't match. One had a tear near the shoulder, the other looked new. The officers exchanged glances when I said that. One of them mentioned quietly that there had been similar fake checkpoints reported earlier that night on other roads nearby. That hit me harder than anything. It meant these guys weren't improvising. They had planned this, maybe even rehearsed it. When I finally got home, I parked in my driveway and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. The adrenaline had drained out, leaving behind this dull, heavy feeling that sat in my chest. My phone kept lighting up with missed calls and messages from friends asking if I'd gotten home safely. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them yet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that crooked badge glinting under the patrol lights and those sneakers moving toward the shadows. Even weeks later, when I drove past that stretch of highway, I caught myself slowing down, half expecting to see those fake officers again. A few days later, a detective from the county sheriff's office called to follow up. He said the men who fled my stop were still being identified but had likely been involved in similar setups on other rural roads that same night. Apparently, they targeted people driving alone, mostly women heading home late. The detail made my stomach twist. He thanked me for staying calm and reporting everything clearly. I did not feel calm. Every part of that night still replayed in fragments. The fake car, the crooked badge, the way one of them kept circling like he was waiting for the right moment. For weeks after that, I avoided driving alone at night. If I had to, I kept my phone on speaker with someone from my family while I drove, headlights locked on the road ahead. Friends would tease me about being paranoid, but then the news broke about another checkpoint, this time 2 counties over. Same fake patrol lights, same reflective jackets. The victims in that case had driven straight through without stopping, and that probably saved them. I remember thinking how close I had come to not being one of the lucky ones. The sheriff's office later confirmed the fake patrol car had been reported stolen from a small auction lot. The IDs they found by the cones belonged to people who had been robbed weeks before in nearby towns. It was like these men collected trophies, pieces of other people's lives to make their act seem more believable. I never found out if they were caught. The calls stopped coming, and eventually the story faded from the local news. But I never drove that stretch of highway again. Even now, years later, every time I see flashing lights on a dark road, my heart races before logic catches up. I pull over only in well-lit places, and I double-check every badge and uniform I see. I know those men are probably long gone, maybe even caught, but the fear they left behind still rides with me. Sometimes when the wind rustles through the trees at night and I catch a glimpse of red and blue through the branches, I have to remind myself it is only passing traffic, and not the echo of that Halloween when monsters dressed as cops tried to make me disappear.